And welcome back to our next edition of the CBB Review Studio podcast. I am Dan Siegel, joined as usual by my co-host Mat Mlodzinski, and we are continuing CBB Rank, counting down the days to the start of the regular season on CBB Review from 100 to 1. And in this episode, we're going to be reviewing teams 80 through 76 in our CBB Rank countdown. Be sure to subscribe to our channel if you have found us and enjoy our content. There will be plenty more throughout the lead up to the preseason and the start of the regular season. Be sure to follow us on the socials as well. But let's get started. So number 80 on CBB Rank, we have Washington State. Matt, Washington State made the tournament last year. They even won a game in the NCAA tournament. But now, what do they get for all that? They get demoted to the West Coast Conference as a leftover of the Pac-12. They'll be competing in the WCC for basketball. In comes David Riley as the head coach for the Cougars, and joining him is an intriguing transfer class.
Yeah, it's intriguing, and you say demoted, right? And that's really for the future of the Washington State Cougars, but I will say a promotion for this season, right? Obviously, you bring in a coach from a mid-major conference. This is most of his guys in the projected starting lineup. So primarily, this is Eastern Washington, right? This is Eastern Washington in the West Coast Conference. A couple guys coming over, put up some good stats, but it's going to be interesting to see how they, in turn, play in the West Coast Conference, because that's honestly a promotion for guys that play there, right? The West Coast Conference is still better than the Big Sky. Now, you got a couple of leftovers as well. You got to transfer Nate Kalmesi from Washington, who might come off the bench. Also, I could see him starting instead of Isaiah Watts, but I think that's really up to how David Riley sees fit with this team. There's definitely some interesting pieces here, and there's a lot of good transfers from Eastern Washington, right? They were a good team, but will this team be ready for the West Coast Conference? I'm not really sure. Like, they obviously were leftover. They weren't able to go to the Big Ten with their counterpart in Washington, but I think it's still going to be a struggle for this team in the WCC.
I don't know if a struggle would exactly be what I'd consider it. I think they won't necessarily finish top 3. I think we actually have them projected 3rd. Maybe I'd put them more 4 to 5 range, because the WCC will be a pretty good conference this year. We already talked about a few teams that we're pretty high on. I'm not sure I feel the same way about Washington State. And you talked about this 5 Eastern Washington transfers, 4 of them projected in the starting lineup. Cedric Coward will be the main guy at the top of the list, the point guard, who see if he will translate to the WCC. Average 15.4 points per game. He made over or nearly 70% of his 2-point shots last year and could really get up there at 6'4". He had some great defensive numbers, some shot blocking numbers, really a physical guy. So I'm high on him, but they also have Lawan Watts from Eastern Washington, Casey Jones from Eastern Washington, Ethan Price from Eastern Washington, a bunch of EWU guys. And while EWU was a good team, it's just hard to see this really being a product that will translate into the NCAA tournament. This is not a WCC that it is going to be just an easy task to get a top 2 seed in an auto bid in. I mean, we'll talk about 2 teams, Gonzaga and St. Mary's, down the line, and I'm really high on Gonzaga. So I don't know. It's going to be tough. And I think this screams an NIT team to me, right? I think they'll get like 20 to 24 wins-ish. I think they'll be in the NIT, but I don't think they will be anywhere near like the bubble.
I think it's a good assessment. I guess maybe I was being a little bit hard on them, and I'll agree with you where, yes, I think this team is going to win games. They're going to be near the top of the WCC, but don't expect Washington State, just because they were a power conference team, to come in here and run the West Coast Conference. Like you mentioned, they're not a top 3 team in this. We might have them projected there. I see them more as 4th or 5th in their new conference.
Number 79 on CBB Rank, we got North Texas. Ross Hodges' first year at North Texas was last year, and it resulted in an NIT bid. Now they lose all 5 of their starters, so a little bit of a new challenge for one of the newer members of the AAC, right? So, yeah, I think their most notable loss is easily Jason Edwards. He averaged nearly 20 points per game last season. He was big, and the thing about North Texas is just from their last 3 to 5 years, even before Ross Hodge, it's always been one guy on the offensive end kind of dictating everything, being their leading scorer by far, and then the rest of the team is just kind of a good defensive team that has role type numbers offensively. And, it was Jason Edwards last season. It was Tyler Perry the year before. Who could be that guy this year? Aiden Wright from Drake probably projects as the best chance to be that guy, but I'm not sure he necessarily takes that step up. He averaged 14.1 points per game in his sophomore year. He's a great shooter, averaged over 80% from the free throw line, over 40% from three-point range. It'll be interesting to see whether the system kind of translates over, because this is a guy who's also really successful, makes a lot of his living at the rim in transition. And North Texas has traditionally been a very slow-paced team, albeit they went a little faster in year one under Ross Hodge. But a couple of factors with, like I said, a completely new starting five that we'll have to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, and that's the thing with this North Texas team. Completely new starting five. Speaking about five, they had 5 players that they lost, real key players from last year's team. Obviously, like you mentioned, Jason Edwards, but I want to go a step further. All 5 of the players North Texas lost that we had as key departures shot at least 35% from 3. 2 of them were well above 40% from 3. That's a lot of great shooters this team is losing. Now, they bring in a couple. Jonathan Massey from Longwood shot it at about 35%. Like you mentioned, Wright from Drake over 40%. So this team still looks like they're going to have enough guys that are able to hit shots from outside. But that was North Texas's offense last season. Will it be the same this year? That's what I'm interested to see, right? Because sometimes guys don't click together. Just because you're a good shooter doesn't mean that if you get into a new system, you're going to keep it up at that same percentage, right? Sometimes you might drop a little bit back if you're not getting the same type of looks. And I think that's the biggest thing here is North Texas wants to have guys that can shoot the ball, but will they be able to continue to do it at such an effective rate? And, they're still going to be a team to beat in the AAC. Like, it seems like North Texas, over the past handful of years, they've been a consistent winner, whether it's Ross Hodge coaching them or someone else. But this year, it just looks a little bit more shaky because we don't know who the guys are going to be.
I think also, it's not looking like a team that's necessarily going to have the greatest facilitators and the guys that'll really generate those open looks in the same way that I mentioned Tyler was just a great all-around playmaking offense threat. But yeah, I think their floor is definitely high. Like I'm fine with them at 79 simply because their metrics over the last 5 years and the numbers of the guys coming in make it seem like it's pretty clear they'll be a top 50 defensive team. But I think that they're super limited offensively, and that's why I'm not projecting them into the top 50 at any point overall.
I think that's a fair assessment. I think they're a good team. They're not a great team, especially from the mid-major level.
Well, this is an interesting one. 78, we got Notre Dame. This is another second-year head coach. It did not go particularly well for Micah Shrewsbury in year one. Keep in mind, the roster was pretty awful last year. This is not an indictment of Shrewsbury as a head coach. He just did not have the guys. However, it's not like they overhauled that entire roster with transfers in the way you'll see a lot of coaches do when they're so drastically unsuccessful in year one. Shrewsbury is doubling down, keeping a lot of the same guys, added, I think, 2 transfers, and we'll see if they could run it back and be more successful. They did end up really improving drastically in conference play, ended up going 7-13 in conference after having some brutal non-con losses. But it all starts with Marcus Burton, right? Who had a phenomenal freshman season.
Yeah, Marcus Burton is the clear leader of this team. The past 2 teams that we just talked about, no true guy, maybe, a handful of guys could be the leaders. This is Marcus Burton's team. What I will say, and I think it's actually 3 transfers on this projected 10, Burke Chabuar from Lehigh, Nikita Konstantinovsky from Monmouth, one of the great names in college basketball, and Matt Alico from Princeton. For Shrewsbury not having a winning team at Notre Dame last year, he sure brought in graduate seniors and a guy in Alico who can win, right? So I think that if they're trying to change the culture, good way to do it, getting some talented guys. that have played winning basketball in other programs. Obviously, Princeton, I mean, you talk about winning. Let's get a guy from there, right? But I think, like you mentioned, this is Burton's team. Tate Davis is very talented. There's great basketball players on Notre Dame. It's do they have enough pieces throughout the 40 minutes to keep it going, right? I do think that Notre Dame is going to be a pretty good basketball team this season. I think the ACC, like usual, is going to be wide open for teams like Notre Dame to get chances at winning, right? Like off the bat, they might not be projected there, but if they can continue to improve, I think we see a much better Notre Dame team this year than we did last season.
I think one thing that Notre Dame also did exceptionally well last year is like the fundamental stuff, the stuff that you could kind of coach up, particularly defensively. They were like night and day from the last year of Mike Bray to the first year of Micah Shrewsbury. And they definitely lacked a lot of production offensively overall. I mean, you talk about Burton, who had the 17-4, but also not the greatest efficiency numbers. He just happened to take a lot of shots. You'll see that a lot on bad teams. But yeah, they add Matt Alico. You mentioned him, the Princeton transfer, who shot over 90% from the line. So again, the fundamental stuff. A lot of great free throw shooters throughout the roster. But still, I think they'll be held back by lack of overall offensive weapons. I think a lot of those other teams in the ACC have more weapons. And I think this will be a team that will take care of the bad teams on their schedule. Unlike last year at some points, I think they'll definitely win their bye games. Hopefully all of them. They have a lot of them, I believe, on their non-con schedule, and a little more competence for Notre Dame. They won't have that painful beginning like last year. That's my prediction right there.
I like it.
Number 77, we're now moving into Mountain Westland. We got the Utah State Aggies, and it does not seem to matter who is coaching for this program. It is just the clear stepping stone from low major to high major basketball. Use Utah State as your platform to get a high major job because it seems to work out for everybody. Craig Smith, Ryan Odom, Danny Sprinkle. Next up on the list now is Jared Calhoun. He's the new head coach from Youngstown State, and the data backs it up. There's no reason to believe that Utah State will not have another successful coaching tenure in Jared Calhoun, and Jared Calhoun will absolutely get a high major job in a couple of years because that's just what past tendencies have clearly indicated.
Yeah, they've indicated that, and it's also indicated that Utah State is probably headed back to the NCAA tournament because they've got a very good team, right? For losing a head coach and bringing in someone new, you got Ian Martinez, a returning player who averaged about 14 points per game last season. You've got Tucker Anderson, also averaged 14 at Central Arkansas, one of the top mid-major gets in the entire transfer portal. And I think those two will really be the top guys. Mason Falslev as well, averaged 11 and 4. I mean, there's a lot of options offensively on this team. I also want to look to Isaac Johnson, right? You got a 7-footer. You lose Great Osabor, you bring in a 7-footer, right? I mean, this is a team that continues to just reload. It's a program that reloads. And I wouldn't be surprised, and I know that it's tough, right? Because Utah State football runs college athletics. But the way their basketball team has been playing recently, they should be moving on to a higher conference. Utah State deserves to be in a power conference the way that they've been playing basketball. Maybe there needs to be a little bit more of an extended, we need to see it a little bit more. But we've seen it for a good chunk of years already, and it just looks like it's going to continue this year. There's no reason this team can't be right at the top of the Mountain West.
Ian Martinez was awesome in that tournament game over TCU. He scored 21. Overall, 13 points per game, I think. Just the improvement of his three-point shot. Ariel, I believe, was the one that wrote this article, and he talked about it from first half of the year to second half of the year. I think his overall numbers are like in the mid-30s, but he shot well over 40%-ish in the second half of the year. So it's clear that he has the potential to be a great plus shooter. And I think their roster building strategy, Jared Calhoun, that is, for a first-year head coach coming into a new conference and a successful program, he got a high quantity of low major guys who are buckets at their previous stops. And that's the key right there, because you don't know whether those guys will necessarily pan out, whether the production at a low major that was not necessarily that successful will translate over to a successful mid to high major type program. But I think if 2 or 3 of these guys click, I mean, you got your projected point guard, Dayton Albury from Queens. You talked about Tucker Anderson, the projected 4 guy from Central Arkansas. You got a couple guys on the bench from Stetson, Utah Valley. Like, if a few of them translate and they're double-digit plus scoring guys, like, that will be another really tough to beat Utah State team. And like I said, I keep saying this, you can't ever doubt a coach that Utah State decides to hire. And again, they have the roster, so no reason to believe though they won't be solid again. I think 77 is kind of underrating them a little bit.
And they're not the only Mountain West team we have today, right?
No, Colorado State 76. It's interesting to have Colorado State above Utah State. I can maybe make a little bit of an argument for it, but just to set the stage here, Colorado State got their second at-large bid in 3 seasons. I think the biggest thing going for them is they have Nico Medved, who's a phenomenal head coach, especially tactically. He is one of the more underrated guys in the country, so it's hard to doubt him. But look at this roster, Matt. It looks a little bit bleak. Gone is Isaiah Stevens. Gone is Joel Scott. Gone is Patrick Cartier. Who are they going to look for? Who are they going to look to now? It is Nick Clifford, the wing, who decided to turn away. He could have been a second-round pick in the NBA draft, but he's like, nah, I'm going to come back to school. I'm going to get better, prove that I could be the main guy on an offense like this. And he absolutely will be asked to be the main guy. And he's excited. He's exciting. He is a really, really explosive athlete. He's got a jump shot, and it'll be his team this year.
There are so many great players, and it certainly will be his team this year. And I really like what Colorado State has. There's one player, though, I'm looking at off the bench, and I want to see what he's going to be able to do in a new role, and that's Ethan Morton, right? A guy who played a career at Purdue and doesn't really have the stats that jump off the page, right? But Purdue's a very talented team. Can Ethan Morton get a lot better and become a better player and be more impactful with Colorado State, right? Because Colorado State isn't too far off in the grand scheme of things from Purdue, right? I mean, Purdue, obviously, last season, the past couple of seasons, one of the top teams in the country. Colorado State is much closer to that than they are to a bottom feeder in the national landscape. And I'm not saying Colorado State's a top 20 team in the country, but they have been ranked at times, and they have been a team that, okay, they're going to make the NCAA tournament. So if Ethan Morton really couldn't fit in on Purdue, I wonder what his fit will be on Colorado State. It's going to be interesting because this is a Colorado State team that is going to need players off the bench. They don't really have a very exciting bench when you look at it. It looks like a team that they have a lot of pop in the starting lineup, and what do they got coming off in the next rotation, right? Can Ethan Morton be a guy that solidifies it and bring in over what he learned with his time at the Boilermakers? That's my takeaway on this Rams team.
Yeah, a lot of question marks. I mean, you got Keyshawn Williams. Also, he was really good at Northern Illinois. He just can't get on the court. So if he could get healthy, like that's a 15-plus point per game guy, maybe.
Yep.
Jalen Crocker-Johnson, transfer from Little Rock. Could he adapt to a bigger size? A guy I talked about a lot is Rashawn Memba, who him breaking out drastically raises their ceiling. He's a center and maybe like the odd man out, someone who people don't really know much about. He's from Austria and a big man who was not recruited too highly, but surprised people, put solid minutes last year and less than 10 per game. But when he was on the court, he was pretty solid. So he needs to play some much better. He needs to be that guy now as a starter and really come into his own really quickly. And if he does, which I believe he can, then Colorado State is much more of a complete team. The front court is very questionable, unless you consider Nick Clifford a forward. He's more of a wing guy, so very questionable front court. And it'd be him and Crocker-Johnson who will have to kind of carry the load there.
Interesting Mountain West. I think that's what we can agree on. The Mountain West is going to be pretty good again this season.
Yeah, as usual. Maybe not the same hype as last year, but they'll absolutely be a fun conference to watch in the 9 o'clock weeknight slates right there. So we'll be excited to monitor that. Thank you everyone for watching and listening this episode. Be sure to subscribe to our channel here at CBB Review and follow us on the socials. You can see scrolling along the bottom of the screen. That'll do it for this episode. We'll be back with another edition of 5 Teams coming up in a couple of days. And be sure to take care.